Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom and Kate, for those very stimulating presentations. And you've brought up a lot of issues, and we already have quite a lot of questions. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at some of the questions that are on the Q&A and use the voting to help us with that. But I'm going to start off with some of the questions that were posed in registration. So I'll start off with Harriet Orr, who's in the Environment Agency. And Harriet asks, how far away from resilience do you think we are with regards infrastructure?
Sure. Shall I start on that one, and then you can add if you want to, Kate? It's a really good and really difficult question. I think is the only short answer to that. I think we're probably closer in some cases and further away in others. But I think it's a very difficult thing to actually measure. There's a really interesting piece of work that the OECD are doing at the moment about developing some metrics to try and start measuring infrastructure resilience. But it's not something we got quite as far with as we might have liked, because we could easily have spent 18 months just looking at that. I think you can see some differences that might be worth highlighting. So certainly in terms of if you look at kind of how the public thinks about things, they have greater experience of disruption in the sort of telecoms and transport sector compared to energy and water. They're also much more willing to put up with those, generally, it comes out, in part because they think they can substitute more easily. That sort of thing is a dynamic that very much might change over time. So I think one of the things we need to bear in mind in this is that, you know, being resilient at one point in time really does change, you know, a month, 6 months, 6 years later over time, and that actually we do need to think about how we continue to kind of evolve our level of resilience, rather than being complacent about, oh, we've solved this challenge or we're performing well, so that means we've kind of cracked it.
And I guess, yeah, the only thing to add to that is, yeah, it's difficult to know how far away you are from something unless you've got some kind of vision or some ideas of how you might measure that. So yeah, it's a difficult question to answer.
Okay, Adrian Smith has asked about what are the biggest barriers integrating social and behavioral changes in climate change resilience?
It's another really good question. Sorry, Kate, I'll have a quick go. And I think one of the interesting ones is just that integration part and the process part of this. And actually, how do you actually gauge people's views on what are really difficult and complicated questions? So there's a kind of supplementary piece to the report that we're hoping to publish very soon, looking at how you set levels of service, and part of that is about how you engage with consumers effectively. So at the moment we rely a lot on stated preference surveys, so getting people to kind of say, oh, I'd be more willing to pay for this in X circumstances, or this is where I put my money. But actually there's a big time inconsistency question here, and people who've experienced disruptions will give you a very different answer to what they're willing to pay for compared to those who haven't. So actually, you know, one of the big challenges is about explaining this to people in a way that they can give sensible and informed views, rather than kind of that off the cuff reaction that perhaps doesn't reflect kind of full consideration of what they might think in different circumstances.
And yeah, just to add to that, I totally agree with that. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting, it came up in the workshop, was this idea that not everybody needs to have a high awareness of what's needed. So one of the things that I talked about was, does everybody need to be able to not just be aware of what the risks are, but know what they need to do within their own context? And the point was made that actually not everybody needs to do that. There are sort of framework organisations that set the scene for other people in the system. So it's only those particular framework organisations or framework people or framework decisions that have that kind of influence over a wider group of people that really need to have high levels of resilience. And then you get things like you've set standards or set levels of service that, so you don't need to have a full, everybody being, engaged in this to some extent.
Okay, thank you both. One final question from the registration is around, what's the link between resilience and transformation when structural changes are needed? That's from Lise Coulter.
Well, some of the framework, I think Tom's already referred to this, and some of the frameworks deliberately bring in transformation. So transformation is seen as very much part of the model or the way that it's expressed. So there's one that talks about 3 kinds of capacity around adaptive capacity and anticipatory capacity, and then transformational capacity. So you're not just building back to the existing system or the business as usual or the status quo, you're actually transforming. So it becomes very much part of what you're trying to do. I think perhaps the question, because I saw it in advance, is trying to get at is if that's part of the model, but you've got people that are perhaps very wedded to a certain way of doing things, like how do you, and they're being, and she actually uses in the full question this word stoic. So people are kind of resistant. So it's like, how do you work with that resistance to letting go of an identity or a way of doing things? And that's, I guess that's where these difficult conversations come in. And it's almost like, so it's that acceptance that things are going to have to change and your ways of doing things that are going to have to shift. And that's a big block. And I think both of us have been saying that is a significant barrier to change, when you kind of can't quite let go that things are going to have to change. And there's a resistance to having those conversations.
I think that's completely right, and I echo all of that. And I think it is very much about how do we have those difficult conversations, particularly about trade-offs, and particularly where the trade-offs are evolving over time and priorities are changing because technology's moved on, the risks have moved on. We need to be upfront about that and kind of have those difficult conversations, face the kind of uncomfortable truths that we can't all have everything all the time.
Okay, thank you. Haley Fowler asks about, how much thought is given to making sure new major infrastructure projects ensure low carbon futures and ensuring that this new system is resilient to future changes as much as possible.
It's a really good question, and one that is very live for us at the National Infrastructure Commission at the moment, because our current project, or one of our current projects, is looking at major rail projects in the Midlands and the North, including, amongst other things, HS2. So it's something we're thinking about quite a lot, and is really important in terms of thinking about both how you make the case for projects. So how do you think about, beyond that kind of basic kind of cost benefit analysis, how do you think about that broader strategic case for things of which, both reliability is an important part and resilience, but also, the carbon piece as well. How do you make sure that kind of infrastructure is on track to kind of help the UK meet its kind of future carbon needs? Something the CCC are doing a lot of thinking about, and kind of infrastructure is increasingly on their radar as something that you can think about, how you think about a pathway for different sectors. But it's harder in some sectors than other. We've talked a lot at the NIC before about road transport and the move towards electric vehicles, but even if you look within that, there are kind of easier pathways and harder ones. So cars and vans, more straightforward. HGVs, much more difficult to kind of decarbonize as quickly. So it's kind of very different in different sectors, but there is certainly an increasing amount of focus being paid to that by industry, but also on the financial and investment side of things, it's an increasing priority for those investing in infrastructure as well. So that's kind of pushing the, actually, is my investment going to be sustainable and, you know, not be flooded in 30 years time, or whatever else that might be.
Okay, I've got one specific question for you, Tom, from our colleague Jason Lowe, with who we work with closely. As you know, the UK Climate Resilience Programme includes a lot of disciplines, and so he's asking, if you had one ask from the physical climate science community, what would be on top of your list? And then the same question for engineering and behavioral science.
Those are some very big questions. I think maybe I'll take them in slightly reverse order. So on the behavioral side of things, I think understanding, you know, consumer reactions to disruption in more detail would be really helpful, particularly how those might evolve. So, you know, is a tolerance of broadband disruption at the moment going to change as we all work from home more, become increasingly dependent on kind of digital communication system? That would be a really interesting question. On the engineering side, there's some modeling questions that are really long term and really difficult, but you know, the questions about digital twins, how we model dependencies and interdependencies, that there's loads of really good and interesting and horrendously complicated work that's already happening, but kind of the development of that is really important. And then I suppose on the physical science side of things, I mean, you know, I think it's those things about, it's all about trying to predict the future again, right? It's what actually, you know, what's the climate scenario that we're actually going to be in? How do we kind of think about that, both in term, and communicate that to people in a way that is not just, you know, we don't need to be foolproof, and things change, evidence gets better over time. But how do we get people to think about the different pathways really effectively? And particularly when you're thinking about, you know, managing an infrastructure asset, there's a range of different scenarios you could have to kind of approach. How do we get people to think about those in a really sensible way that they can kind of make decisions that don't kind of get them locked in for hundreds of years, or well, perhaps decades rather than hundreds of years in some cases. Sorry, that's a very wishy-washy answer, but some very quick thoughts.
Great, thank you very much, both. We're running against time here now, and so I just would like to thank you both for all your all the answers to all the questions. Much appreciated. We will do a virtual applause now, and I guess I just wanted to finish off with a couple of announcements about the next seminars. So in 2 weeks' time, we return to some of the projects that were funded in the first phase of the program. So Professor Rachel Warren from the Tyndall Center for Climate Change will talk to us about the project that she led on impacts and risk assessments to better inform resilience planning. And we'll have a respondent from the Committee on Climate Change through Gemma Holmes. And then the following 2 weeks afterwards, we'll have Professor Richard Betts from both the University of Exeter and the Met Office. Richard is leading the Climate Change Risk Assessment Evidence Report, and he'll be joined by Catherine Brown from the Committee on Climate Change. So they'll be talking about how they've been gathering evidence for the third climate change risk assessment. So those links, if you click on those links, you can then register for those 2 seminars. And finally, I'll mention that we have this a special issue currently to try to feed research into the climate change risk assessment, and currently this is still open until the end of July. With this journal, so do submit your research to us by the end of July. The journal's just got its first impact factor of 4.9, so there's an extra incentive there to do that. So thank you very much for watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with Rachel Warren's talk. As I said earlier, do subscribe to our newsletter today, and you'll get an email about that. thanks. Yeah, thanks for watching, and see you soon. And thank you again, Tom and Kate. Okay, thanks. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.